When you start recording someone else's wise thoughts, you have no idea that this work is not a path to enlightenment, but an endless circle of hell where every new, proper word becomes a heavy stone in the sack of oblivion. You are neither a hero, nor a prophet, nor even a disciple. You are just a shadow in the corner, doomed to preserve advice that no one will ever use, but everyone will argue about until they are hoarse. In your hands are the words of the great Confucius, but at night they sound like the weary mumbling of old men no one listens to. The story you are collecting is not a hymn to wisdom, but a chronicle of irony and pointless labor. Be prepared. Ahead lies not the light of truth, but the slow darkness of disappointment. But before you settle in, leave a like under this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm really curious to see who's joined us. Now, make yourself comfortable. Let's begin. You first heard the name of Confucius in the sort of childhood that sours you on hope early and makes you an expert in boredom. It is whispered in the cold, silent mornings of your family's small house, where the smell of boiled millet is as inescapable as the sense of futility. Confucius, your uncle said, is a man who knows everything and has answers for nothing. You, still young, did not understand the joke. You only wondered why so many grown men seemed so intent on listening to a philosopher who did not appear to enjoy life any more than the rest of you. By the time you are old enough to hold a brush without trembling, you realize that everyone around you is searching for meaning in the words of Confucius, but nobody has quite figured out how to apply them. Your father, who grows thinner each season, sighs at the mention of the name and says, "Remember what Confucius taught. A wise man knows his own limitations." You notice he says this whenever he fails at something. If wisdom is so closely linked to failure, you suspect that your family must be exceptionally wise. There is nothing grand about your first task. You are told to write down the sayings of Confucius because you are the only one with neat enough handwriting and poor enough prospects to be trusted with such a menial, thankless job. For the sake of the future, your mother insists, someone must preserve wisdom. The future, you suspect, is an invention of adults to justify all kinds of pointless suffering. Your room, if it can be called a room, becomes your prison. There is a small window facing a crooked tree, which you quickly learn to hate as its shadow creeps along the floor like a reminder of time wasted. You sit at your table and look at the pile of old bamboo slips and wonder if you will be the last person on earth to care about any of this. The world outside seems determined to forget. Everyone is busy with their own private disasters, leaving you alone with the quiet burden of memory. You begin by trying to recall the first time you heard a wise saying from the master himself. But memory is tricky and unreliable, and every time you reach for a concrete phrase, it dissolves into a vague sense of disappointment. Was it, "To study and not think is a waste"? Or was it, "To think and not study is dangerous"? You suspect both are true, but neither helps you sleep at night. You write them both down because no one will ever check. The act of writing becomes a ritual of resentment. The brush scrapes against the bamboo, the ink stains your fingers, the words dry before you even finish the line. Outside, children chase each other, free from the tyranny of inherited wisdom. You envy them and hate them, sometimes both at once. You tell yourself that you are doing something noble, but it feels more like punishment. With every new proverb, you sense the weight of expectation. It is not enough to simply write, you are supposed to understand. The grown ups nod gravely whenever you finish a slip, as if you have accomplished something significant. But all you have done is copy a few words that may or may not matter in 100 years. Secretly, you wonder if anyone in the future will ever thank you for this effort. You doubt it. Even the present seems ungrateful. At night, you stare at the unfinished stack, feeling the enormity of the task. To record wisdom for the ages, when you are barely wise enough to keep your own hands clean, is a peculiar kind of torment. Your dreams are full of half remembered sayings and faceless ancestors demanding you write faster, better, deeper. One morning, just as dawn begins to seep through your miserable window, you realize that this is not about wisdom at all. It is about survival. To record the words of Confucius is to distract yourself from the slow march of days, the endless repetition of chores, and the quiet, patient misery that defines your world. You tell yourself that you will preserve these words for the future, but secretly, you hope the future never comes because it would only bring more of the same. So you pick up your brush again, ink stained and half asleep, and prepare to write. You are the chronicler of advice no one will heed, the recorder of wisdom that will be misinterpreted for generations, the custodian of meaning in a world that has lost interest. It is a fate you neither chose nor escaped. You settle into it because what else is there to do? And as you begin, you realize with a mixture of irony and resignation that perhaps this is the most Confucian lesson of all. The second challenge arrives as quietly and inexorably as dust settling on your writing table. You sit, brush in hand, ready to capture the wisdom of ages, and you realize, with the same slow horror that accompanies all important discoveries, that no one, not even the most devoted follower, can agree on how Confucius began his teachings. There are 20 versions of the master's first speech, and each is delivered with the conviction of someone who has never doubted anything in their life. You find yourself surrounded by self appointed experts. Some are old men with beards that have seen too many winters. Others are young and eager, their faces flushed with the hope that being near wisdom will somehow make them wise by osmosis. They all have their own story of that legendary first lesson, and each story contradicts the last. One claims that Confucius began with a joke about the rain. Another insists it was a solemn pronouncement on the nature of loyalty. A third swears that the true beginning is silence, that the master said nothing for an entire day, letting his students stew in confusion until enlightenment bloomed like mildew in their brains. You attempt to write a clean, authoritative introduction. You begin, On the first day, the master said, and then you stop, brush hovering in the air. Which first day? Which master? And most importantly, which saying? Each answer feels like a lie by omission, an act of quiet betrayal against the shifting sands of memory. You try again. Some say the Master spoke of virtue, others of patience. Still others recall only his silence. Immediately you are dissatisfied. It sounds less like the beginning of a great chronicle and more like an apology for your own ignorance. Determined to at least do something, you write out all 20 possible versions of Confucius's first teaching, numbering each one with painful precision. By the time you reach the seventh, you notice your mind wandering, your hand cramping, your patience eroding grain by grain. You wonder if anyone in the future will care that you made the effort to record every possibility, or if your attempts at accuracy will simply be dismissed as indecision. Around you, life continues. Servants sweep the courtyard. The smell of rice vinegar drifts through the thin walls. Outside, students quarrel quietly about which version is the most authentic, as if they might persuade history itself to take their side. You are left with the growing suspicion that truth is whatever survives the loudest argument. In your more cynical moments, you imagine some poor soul 100 years from now, hunched over your writings, cursing you for your thoroughness. Why did this chronicler not simply choose one version and move on? They will mutter, and in that moment, you feel an odd kinship with all future sufferers of bureaucracy. The pile of introductions on your desk grows taller. You attempt to rank them by plausibility, only to discover that plausibility is as fickle as fortune. The story about the joke seems the most human, but you suspect it is a later addition by someone who wished Confucius had been funnier than he was. The tale of silence is poetic, but if you are honest, also insufferable. The rest are a muddle of half remembered aphorisms and clumsy translations. You briefly consider making up your own beginning, something pithy and grand, but even your imagination is exhausted by the task. In the evenings, you sit with your notes and listen to the wind scraping against the paper walls. You recall the old saying, history is written by the survivors, not the honest. You feel neither particularly surviving nor especially honest, but you press on, aware that stopping would be the greatest failure of all. You start noticing how this quest for the right version of the master's introduction has changed you. Your own voice, once eager and naive, now sounds brittle and tired, as if you are already decades older. The others treat you with increasing suspicion, whispering about your unusual thoroughness, as if it were a sign of deviance. Sometimes you catch yourself wishing you could return to ignorance, to simply copy what you are told without worrying about accuracy. But you are already too far gone for that. Eventually, you realize you must choose. If you are going to be remembered for anything, it will be for your ability to decide, if only under duress. So you settle on a compromise. You write a short preface explaining that no one truly remembers how the master began, that every account is a shade of truth colored by memory, pride, and wishful thinking. You conclude with a sort of grim pride that the very uncertainty of beginnings is the first real lesson. And so, your chronicle does not begin with thunder or wisdom, but with confusion and doubt. You secretly hope that this, too, is in keeping with the spirit of Confucius, who seemed to delight in making everything more complicated than necessary. By the end of this ordeal, you are left with a stack of introductions, a persistent headache, and a new appreciation for the futility of certainty. It is only the beginning, and already you feel as if you have lived a dozen lifetimes in the service of remembering what no one else remembers. You put down your brush, stare at the endless bamboo slips, and wonder if the greatest wisdom is simply this: admit that you do not know and write anyway. At some point in your tedious chronicle, you finally find a piece of advice that everyone can agree on, or at least, no one is motivated enough to dispute. It is deceptively simple, almost cruel in its clarity. Rise at dawn, Confucius is said to have instructed, for those who sleep through the morning waste their days, and those who waste their days waste their lives. You pause, brush suspended in the air, and allow yourself a private moment of loathing. You have never liked mornings. They always arrive too soon, dragging you from uneasy dreams into a world of obligations you never asked for. You do not share the master's enthusiasm for sunrise, nor his faith in the discipline it represents. To you, dawn is merely a transition from the relative mercy of sleep to the slow grind of conscious existence. Yet here you are, forced to immortalize a teaching that feels like an insult. The irony is heavy. Even as you write, you resent the commandment, rise at dawn, as if virtue is a matter of setting an alarm, as if the world could be redeemed simply by getting up early. You imagine all the tired villagers stumbling out of their beds, cursing Confucius under their breath, and you wonder if anyone has ever dared to admit that not all wisdom is equally welcome. If the future is to be built on these foundations, you hope for their sake it includes better beds. Still, you dutifully copy the words. You add flourishes to the calligraphy, as if beauty can compensate for the bleakness of the content. Around you, the house stirs to life. The servants begin their chores, and your mother comes to check if you are awake, never failing to mention that Confucius himself would have already been hard at work. You nod, suppressing the urge to say something unwise. It does not escape your notice that most of the elders who praise the virtue of early rising do so from the comfort of their mats, well after the sun has climbed into the sky. The real work is always done by others, the uncelebrated and unrecorded, while the keepers of wisdom recline and dispense advice. This, you suspect, is one of the unwritten rules of history. Those who give orders rarely follow them. You look for variations of the advice in other sources. Some say the master was even more severe. He who rises after the rooster has crowed will never achieve greatness. Others claim a gentler version. Begin your tasks with the light, and let diligence be your companion. You include all of them, just in case the future cares about nuance. But the message is always the same: wake up, get to work, and do not ask questions. As you transcribe these sayings, you find your mind drifting to darker places. You recall your own father, stooped with age and disappointment, dragging himself into the fields each morning with the same resigned expression. He was never late, never lazy, but also never satisfied. You wonder if rising early ever brought him happiness, or if it merely prolonged his suffering. Perhaps there is a wisdom in laziness that the master never explored. There is a certain bleak humor in this part of your task. You realize that the greatest legacy you will leave behind is a detailed instruction manual for a life you do not wish to live. The teachings of Confucius, so often invoked as the cure for all human failings, begin to sound more and more like a list of impossible standards dreamed up by someone determined to make life harder for everyone, including himself. You try to imagine what would happen if you simply refused to record this particular advice. Would the world collapse into chaos? Would future generations rise at noon, invent poetry in bed, and overthrow the tyranny of early mornings? The fantasy is pleasant, but you know better. There is always someone eager to enforce discipline, someone who believes that suffering builds character. Still, you cannot resist adding a note in the margin just for yourself. Let it be known, you write in tiny, cramped script, that the chronicler despises dawn and suspects the master did as well, but was too proud to admit it. It is the closest thing to rebellion you allow yourself. When the sun finally rises high enough to flood your small room with light, you set your brush aside and stretch your aching fingers. You look at the neat rows of characters and wonder if they will survive the centuries or if they will be swept away by the next passing fashion. Perhaps, you think, every generation needs its own dawn to hate. There is a bitter comfort in the monotony of it all. The world changes, but the burdens remain the same. You are the chronicler of commands you do not believe, the guardian of routines that drain the color from the world. You wish just once for a piece of wisdom that celebrated rest or praised idleness, but you know better than to expect such mercy. So you keep writing. The brush scratches on the bamboo, the ink runs low, and you resign yourself to another day in the service of impossible standards. Perhaps this is the truest lesson of all. Wisdom may not make you happy, but it does keep you busy. And sometimes that is enough to survive another morning. Of all the chores assigned to you in your thankless role as chronicler, none are so wearisome as the task of sitting silently in the background while Confucius entertains visiting officials. You become, quite against your will, a sort of accidental court stenographer, the invisible presence with a brush, condemned to record every platitude, every labored metaphor, every tiresome argument about virtue and governance. You quickly learn that officials are always the same, whether they arrive clad in silk or homespun. They bow, they flatter, they recite their own favorite scraps of ancient wisdom as if auditioning for a role in their own story. Their eyes dart about the room, always searching for an advantage. The less they understand Confucius, the more insistently they praise him. It would be funny if it were not so exhausting. Confucius, for his part, meets them all with the same measured courtesy. He listens, or at least he pretends to. His expression is so serene that you wonder if he has achieved a sort of spiritual deafness. The conversation always drifts to power, what it is, who deserves it, how it should be used. The officials want to hear the secret formula for authority, the alchemy that will turn their anxieties into certainty. They never seem to realize that Confucius has no secrets to share, only questions and more questions. You try to record his words with scrupulous accuracy. To rule is to serve, he says one afternoon, and you dutifully scratch it onto a fresh bamboo slip. The virtue of a leader is like the wind. The virtue of the people is like the grass. When the wind blows, the grass bends. It sounds impressive, especially to the officials, who nod solemnly, as if they have just witnessed the unveiling of cosmic truth. But in the evenings, when the guests have departed and the lamps burn low, you replay these conversations in your mind. The wind, the grass, the bending. Does anyone really know what it means? Is power simply the art of moving people in the direction you desire, or is it a heavy cloak that strangles even the strongest? You begin to suspect that the master's metaphors are deliberately vague, designed to leave everyone slightly dissatisfied, equally unsure. Still, the routine is unchanging. The officials arrive, the words flow, the nods multiply. You watch the game play out with a sense of grim amusement. Each man is certain that he is different, that he alone will understand the true nature of authority. In reality, they are all searching for permission to do what they have already decided to do. One morning, a particularly ambitious magistrate asks, "Master, how shall I ensure that my subordinates obey me without resentment?" Confucius does not hesitate. Rule yourself first, and your rule over others will follow. The magistrate beams, writes this down as if it were a newly discovered law of the universe, and proceeds to ignore it entirely. You begin to catalog these moments in your own private way. In the margins of your records, you invent a secret code, a small circle for every official who asks about power, a tiny slash for each who leaves disappointed. By the end of one especially long week, the pages are nearly black with your marks. It gives you a certain bleak satisfaction to measure futility so precisely. Outside the compound, rumors circulate that Confucius is plotting some grand political maneuver, that he holds the fate of kingdoms in his hands. You are tempted to laugh. If only they knew how much time is wasted on the repetition of the same tired questions, the endless search for reassurance from a man who refuses to offer any. At night, you dream of the officials. In your nightmares, they multiply without end, a swarm of anxious, bowing figures who recite the master's sayings with the fervor of drowning men clinging to driftwood. You wake, sweating and irritated, only to realize that the real day promises more of the same. You do not bother to ask yourself why you continue. Duty is a habit as much as an obligation. Besides, someone must bear witness to the theater of power, the way it exhausts everyone who touches it, the way it corrupts not only the powerful, but also those forced to serve them. You tell yourself that your writing, however dull, is a kind of insurance. If the world ever improves, you will have recorded the evidence that it once did not. Yet sometimes, just for a moment, you catch a flicker of something genuine. After the officials leave and the night is quiet, you find Confucius staring into the darkness, his mask of wisdom slipped ever so slightly. He looks tired, as if the burden of being Confucius weighs heavier than any government position. You wonder if he too is exhausted by the game. On these rare occasions, you are tempted to ask your own questions. You want to know if power can be anything but lonely, if virtue ever truly triumphs over self interest, if there is any escape from the eternal cycle of disappointment. But you never do. Instead, you pick up your brush, record the day's teachings, and prepare yourself for tomorrow's performance. You suspect that this, more than anything else, is the real wisdom to be preserved. The world is run by tired men pretending to be wise, and chronicled by even more tired scribes pretending to care. In the end, you are left with pages full of elegant advice and a mind full of quiet doubts. And so the chronicle grows, not with answers, but with endless, echoing questions. You find yourself increasingly preoccupied with the subject of honesty. It is everywhere, woven into the fabric of Confucius's advice, stitched into his responses with all the subtlety of a bright red patch on a funeral robe. The more you listen, the more you realize how haunted everyone is by the question of truth. No matter how many times the master pronounces, "Be honest," or "Virtue is found in truthfulness," those who gather to hear him seem more devoted to the art of polite lying than to any abstract ideal. You notice the pattern, uncomfortably obvious. Every time a new visitor arrives, they spend the first few minutes telling Confucius what a genius he is, what a blessing it is to stand in his presence, how the whole village, or province, or kingdom, depending on the size of the bribe, lives in awe of his wisdom. Sometimes, if the visitor is particularly desperate, they will throw in a story about how a passing bird fell silent to listen to his teachings. Confucius never corrects them. He only smiles with that weary, knowing look that you have begun to hate. And then, with the flattery exhausted, comes the inevitable question, always delivered with a conspiratorial whisper: how can one remain honest in a world that rewards cunning? It is a question so ancient that it probably predates language itself. The master always answers the same way, never raising his voice, never blinking. Be honest, even when it does not serve your advantage. Virtue is its own reward. You write it down, just as you have a dozen times before. You notice that this particular advice has a curious effect on the visitors. Some nod vigorously, eager to appear virtuous. Others frown. their faces briefly unguarded. You see the same expression you see in the mirror every morning, that flash of resignation, the understanding that this advice will never change the way the world works. It is, you realize, less a commandment than a confession. Everyone wants to be honest. No one wants to pay the price. You try to imagine a world where truthfulness is the default, where no one ever bends the facts to avoid embarrassment or profit. It is not a world you recognize. Even in your own family, honesty is something rationed out like salt in a famine. Your mother lies about how much rice is left. Your father lies about the size of his debts. Your siblings lie about everything, especially the things that matter most. You suspect that honesty, in the form that Confucius recommends, is as rare as dragons. Still, you write the words. You make the characters bold, as if the strength of your brush might somehow make the advice more real. You record on all the variations you can find. Let your words be as true at midnight as at noon. Better to lose face than to lose honor. The honest man may die poor, but he will not die ashamed. It is a small comfort, but you cling to it the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. One evening, after a particularly long day spent transcribing these earnest but hopelessly naive pronouncements, you overhear a conversation between two students. "The master is right," says one, "but if I were honest about my opinion of the magistrate, I would be beaten." The other laughs and agrees, and they both slip away into the darkness, their laughter trailing behind them like the echo of a lost cause. You consider confronting Confucius about the practical value of his advice, but you know how the conversation would go. He would listen, nod thoughtfully, and respond with another riddle. If the world is dishonest, all the more reason to be honest yourself. You would nod, pretending to understand, and write it down, even though both of you know it is unlikely to survive its first real test. Sometimes you fantasize about what would happen if everyone followed this advice for a single day. Would the world collapse under the weight of inconvenient truths, or would it be transformed by a flood of awkward sincerity? You suspect the former. The world, as far as you can tell, runs on a kind of polite deceit that keeps the peace even as it erodes the spirit. Honesty, in its purest form, would be revolutionary, and you have seen enough revolutions to know they rarely end well for the honest. You cannot help but laugh at the bleakness of it all. Here you are, preserving words that almost no one intends to live by, ensuring their survival for a future that may be even more cynical than the present. You tell yourself that there is value in the effort, even if the results are disappointing. Perhaps the act of writing truth again and again is itself a kind of virtue, a silent protest against the world's relentless compromise. And so you continue. The stack of bamboo slips grows, each one inscribed with another variation on the theme of honesty. You imagine a future scholar stumbling across your records, wondering why so much emphasis was placed on a virtue that seems so obviously doomed. Perhaps you think they will recognize the joke. Perhaps they will see the irony that has become the defining feature of your work. As the light fades and the shadows grow long, you finish another slip and set your brush aside. For a moment, you allow yourself to hope that somewhere someone will read these words and find comfort in them, not because they are true, but because someone cared enough to write them down. It is a small hope, but in the world of Confucius, small hopes are all that endure. With a sigh, you close your eyes and prepare for another day of writing advice that no one will follow, in the certain knowledge that the world will go on much as it always has, hungry for honesty, but rarely willing to pay its price. Soon enough, as your stack of slips swells and your fingers grow stained and cramped, you notice a curious phenomenon. Some of the master's advice, once thought original, begins to repeat itself in slightly altered forms. You find, as you trudge through the archives of your own making, that Confucius was either fond of repeating himself, or his disciples could not remember which particular version of each saying they had heard. The distinction, you come to believe, is academic. You discover, for instance, no fewer than 3 variations of the maxim about humility. The wise man is humble in all things. A true scholar bows to wisdom, not to pride. It is better to be silent and seem wise than to speak and remove all doubt. Each version, offered up in different contexts by different students and with different embellishments, circles the same tired point. The repetition is not just tiresome, it is existentially wearying. You begin to suspect that the master's greatest talent may have been inventing new ways to say the same old thing. And yet, you cannot simply discard these duplicates. The tradition, and after all, is to preserve every utterance, every scrap, lest future generations accuse you of omitting some essential piece of the puzzle. You develop a system, at first informal and later obsessive. You copy out each new version and annotate it with the names of those who claim to remember it best, as if assigning credit might grant meaning to the monotony. You imagine the future reader, some earnest youth, or, more likely, another bored chronicler, poring over these slips and wondering why so much effort was spent preserving near identical fragments of wisdom. You imagine them cursing your name as you have silently cursed those before you. It gives you a kind of grim solidarity with all bureaucrats, all archivists, all sufferers of the chronicler's curse. At times, to amuse yourself, you write the repeated maxims in slightly different tones, just to see how the mood changes. The wise man is humble in all things, you record gravely, as if chiseling the phrase into stone. Then, in a fit of spite, you add, a wise man is humble even when surrounded by fools, and you wonder if that will slip past the censors. For your own pleasure, you imagine even gloomier versions. The humble man is ignored, and the proud man is punished. Choose your misery. No one notices. No one ever notices. The officials and students, for all their talk of discipline and order, seem unable to recall whether they have heard the latest maxim before. Occasionally, a new pupil will parrot back one of these recycled aphorisms as if it were a revelation, and everyone will nod sagely. You begin to suspect that the repetition itself is a form of wisdom, that, like the turning of the seasons or the return of daily hunger, the sameness is inevitable, a kind of grim comfort. One afternoon, overcome by a strange mixture of exhaustion and mischief, you begin composing mock sayings of your own. A wise man knows the value of repetition, for he will hear the same advice until he wishes for deafness. You write this on a slip and tuck it away among the master's real sayings, unsure if anyone will ever notice the difference. Sometimes you feel you are being punished, not for your own failings, but for the world's inability to learn from its own mistakes. You imagine that the endless recurrence of advice is a kind of cosmic joke, with you as the straight man. Perhaps the master himself was in on it. Perhaps, surrounded by students desperate for guidance, he simply repeated the first thing that popped into his head, watching as it spread like a plague of wisdom across the land. You keep meticulous records of these repetitions, as if the act of cataloging can redeem the tedium. Each slip is a testament to the fact that nothing truly changes, not the content of the advice, not the willingness to listen, not the likelihood of anyone following it. It is a lesson in futility that you learn anew with every fresh batch of sayings. The other students begin to avoid you. They sense, perhaps, that you are no longer as devoted as they are to the fiction of originality. Your gaze has become too searching, your questions too pointed. You are the historian at the feast, always reminding the revelers that their stories have all been told before. Late at night, by the faint light of an oil lamp, you add a final note to the day's work. Repetition is the mother of forgetting, and only the chronicler remembers what ought to be forgotten. It is your own private joke, a tiny rebellion against the endless cycle. You wonder sometimes if the master himself ever grew weary of hearing his own words echoed back at him. Did he recognize himself in the voices of his followers, or did he hear only the hollow sound of ideas repeated until they lost all meaning? Still, you write. Still, you copy. The work is unending, the advice is unchanging, and the cycle continues. You remind yourself that someone, somewhere, must preserve the pattern, even if it is only so future generations will know just how inescapable it truly was. You would think, after weeks spent in the orbit of Confucius and his ever growing flock of students, that you might grow accustomed to the shape and flavor of his advice. Yet here you are, faced with another paradox so profound and impractical that it threatens to tip you from mild cynicism into genuine despair. Understand others before you judge them, the master intones, his eyes fixed on some distant point just past your left ear. The gathered students nod and murmur approval, as if the difficulty of such a task is obvious to no one but you. You try, you truly do, to take this latest counsel seriously. For a full day, you resolve not to pass judgment on anyone before first attempting to understand their motives, their fears, their tangled inner lives. The results are disastrous, if not entirely predictable. Your first test comes swiftly. A quarrel breaks out between two junior students over a missing sandal. One accuses the other of theft. The other protests innocence with righteous tears. Ordinarily, you would dismiss the whole affair as childish pettiness. Today, however, you catch yourself hesitating, trying to understand each boy's position. The sandalless student is proud and quick tempered, but also frightened of appearing weak. The accused, meanwhile, is desperate for approval and so eager to avoid conflict that he would rather accept blame than argue. You find yourself trapped in a maze of sympathy. The fight fizzles out, unsolved. Neither boy is satisfied. You are left with a headache and the uncomfortable sense that in trying to understand, you have failed to accomplish anything at all. Later, when you share your confusion with one of the senior students, he shrugs and says, "Sometimes understanding is the opposite of justice." You suspect this wisdom is entirely his own, and you consider writing it down for future generations of the perpetually conflicted. Throughout the week, you redouble your efforts. You sit quietly while older students debate the best way to honor their parents, their voices rising with the heat of conviction. You try to understand the source of each argument, to trace each sharp word back to the anxieties and disappointments that gave it birth. What you discover is not harmony, but exhaustion. Every motive is layered, every kindness shadowed by self interest, every act of malice softened by regret. The more you understand, the less you know what anyone actually wants. In the marketplace, you watch a merchant cheat his customers with the same bland smile he uses to greet his children. You try to imagine what drives him: hunger, fear, the pressure to provide. By the time you have finished understanding him, he has cheated two more customers and is packing up for the day. You are left with nothing but a faint, futile anger. You begin to suspect that the advice to understand before judging is less a guide to virtuous living and more a recipe for paralysis. Everyone's actions, viewed from a sufficient distance, become comprehensible, even inevitable. Judgment, for all its risks, at least has the virtue of decisiveness. Understanding, it seems, only delays the moment when you must act. You raise these concerns, tentatively, with Confucius himself one evening as he prepares to retire. "Master," you say, "how can I judge anyone now that I see how tangled their reasons are?" He smiles that familiar, enigmatic smile and replies, "Only the wisest of men can judge without error, and so it is better to understand, even if it brings you no comfort." You bow, thank him, and return to your notes, wondering if comfort is not, after all, the point of wisdom. Privately, you record your doubts in a hidden slip, one that you promise yourself no one will ever read. To understand is to excuse, to judge is to offend. To do neither is to disappear. It is the closest you have come to honesty since you began this work. In the days that follow, you observe your fellow students with new wariness. The ones who embrace the master's teaching most eagerly are often those least willing to extend real understanding. Their judgments, when they come, are all the sharper for being clothed in the language of empathy. You notice that the students who suffer most are those who try, as you have, to live the teaching in full. They become hesitant, uncertain, lost in a fog of other people's motives. You realize, with a pang of recognition, that you have stumbled onto a central truth of this whole enterprise. Most advice is easier to speak than to follow. The gap between saying and doing, between knowing and being, is as wide as the river that separates your compound from the world outside. At night, you lie awake, replaying the day's endless cycle of attempts and failures. You wonder if future generations will find your chronicles helpful or merely maddening. You picture a scholar, centuries from now, reading your meticulous records of contradictory advice, and you hope, at the very least, that they will laugh. Perhaps, you decide, the only true wisdom is to accept that understanding others will never make you less lonely. But still, you write it down. You are the chronicler, after all, and the work must go on. You do not remember when the arguments started, only that they have become as regular as meals and as predictable as the setting sun. At first, the students of Confucius debated only the finer points of etiquette or the proper way to greet a distant cousin. But now, with every new proverb you record, you can be certain that someone will find a reason to contest it. It is as if the words of the master exist solely to provoke disagreement, to invite the kind of fruitless debate that keeps everyone too busy to notice their own boredom. Today, the argument is about the meaning of a particular piece of advice. When facing a great wrong, speak the truth even if your voice trembles. The phrase is not new. You have written it at least 3 times before, each time in slightly different company, each time to slightly different effect. This morning, however, the assembled students fall upon it with unusual zeal. It means we should confront the magistrate about the unfair taxes, says one, pounding his fist against the table for emphasis. No, insists another, his voice thick with righteous caution. It means we must first be sure what is truly wrong. Otherwise, we only add to the confusion. A third student, older and more cynical, laughs softly. It means nothing at all. It is just another way to keep ourselves talking, so we never have to do anything. You sit in the corner, brush poised above a fresh slip, watching the debate swirl and rise like smoke. No one asks for your opinion. Chroniclers, it seems, are meant to be invisible, their judgments absorbed by the silent wood of their writing desks. Still, you cannot help but wonder if the wisdom you are tasked with recording is meant to be followed at all, or simply discussed to death. The argument stretches through the morning. Cups of tea grow cold. Students repeat the same points with increasing volume, as if shouting can make an idea truer. You count the repetitions, mentally marking each recycled phrase. You recall, not for the first time, how much of life is spent saying what has already been said in ways that only sound new to those who have not been paying attention. You are struck by a bleak insight. Perhaps wisdom is less a matter of knowing what to do and more a matter of finding new ways to disagree about it. Advice, after all, is a living thing only when it is debated. Once everyone agrees, it dies, preserved in the silence of consensus. The irony is hard to ignore. Confucius himself, the man whose sayings fill your days and crowd your dreams, is rarely present for these squabbles. When he does appear, he listens with an expression that could be mistaken for serenity, but which you now recognize as the careful neutrality of someone who has heard it all before. Occasionally, the master will intervene, but never to settle the matter. Instead, he adds another layer of ambiguity. Truth is like water, he says once, clear only when it is still and shallow. Deep, it distorts all that it reflects. The students fall silent, unsure whether they have been chastised or merely confused. You dutifully record his words, already anticipating the arguments they will provoke tomorrow. By the afternoon, the original dispute has lost all shape. The students now argue about whether speaking out is ever worth the risk, whether truth can survive in a corrupt world, and whether silence, in the end, is not the truest form of protest. Each point leads to another, like a river branching endlessly toward the sea. You wonder how much of your life will be spent recording arguments that have no conclusion. In the margin of your notes, you scribble a private observation. Wisdom is not a road, but a circle. The further you travel, the more you find yourself exactly where you began. You think of all the effort poured into these debates, all the clever arguments and wounded pride, and you wonder if anything will remain when the noise has faded. Sometimes, late at night, you are seized by the urge to gather all the students together and confess the truth, that the advice of the master is not a solution to the world's problems, but a way of keeping them alive, that you, the supposed preserver of wisdom, have come to doubt whether any of it matters at all. But you do not. Instead, you keep your silence, your dotes tucked between the lines of neat calligraphy. As the day ends, the argument sputters out from exhaustion rather than resolution. The students drift away, some still muttering, others silent and sullen. You gather your slips, careful to record not just the words of the master, but the fact of the disagreement itself. Moral certainty, you write, is a fleeting comfort. Debate is the truest tradition. You realize, with a weary sort of pride, that you have become the historian of argument, the chronicler of disagreement. The wisdom you preserve is not a beacon, but a bonfire, something to gather around, to warm your hands, and to watch as it burns itself out in the night. And as you set your notes aside and prepare for another sleepless evening, you find a grim consolation in the thought that, if nothing else, your work will survive as a testament to humanity's endless, restless need to argue. Eventually, your work brings you outside the protective confines of the compound, where the real world, in all its indifferent chaos, makes a mockery of your careful notes. You accompany Confucius to a nearby village for the monthly gathering, not because you wish to, but because, as chronicler, you are expected to record every public pronouncement and passing aphorism. You go with the resigned air of a prisoner transferred between cells. It is not your first visit, and you know what to expect. The villagers, battered by harvest and tax, eye the approaching party with wariness. Most have heard of Confucius, but few are eager for another round of unsolicited advice. You can read their expressions. Here comes the man who will tell us what we already know, but with more words and less warmth. The master stands before them, surrounded by his students, and delivers another polished homily on virtue. He who tends his field with care will never hunger, he proclaims, and you record the words with practiced precision. The villagers nod politely, then turn away, more interested in the state of their boots than the state of their souls. You see it everywhere, in the bored eyes of the elders, in the anxious glances of the children, in the way even the dogs seem unimpressed. The more noble the advice, the less it seems to matter here, where mud and hunger are the only laws that count. You write everything down, knowing already that these words will drift through the village like autumn leaves, briefly noticed before being trampled into the dirt. In the afternoon, you observe Confucius as he tries to engage a group of farmers. He asks about their troubles. They respond with cautious, non-committal phrases. One old man, when pressed for an opinion on filial piety, mutters that he is too busy keeping his grandchildren fed to worry about philosophy. Another, asked about the moral order of society, grins and says, "Let the officials talk about that. We just want the rain to come." You find yourself quietly agreeing with them. You too have grown weary of being told how to live, especially by men who never seem to dirty their own hands. You scribble a note in the margin. No one loves a moralist, least of all those who are expected to listen. It is the sort of truth that cannot be spoken aloud, but which you suspect everyone feels deep down. The students, ever eager to impress, attempt to explain the master's teachings in simpler terms, hoping to win over the crowd. Their efforts are met with polite indifference. You watch as one student launches into a lengthy metaphor about bamboo and resilience. The villagers respond by checking their tools and moving quietly away. Another tries to inspire them with a tale of legendary virtue. A child interrupts to ask if there will be any rice for supper. You cannot help but feel the futility of it all. The gulf between the world of ideas and the world of necessity is vast, and no bridge of eloquence can span it. You begin to suspect that most wisdom is wasted on those who have no time for it, and that true philosophy flourishes only in places where it does not have to contend with hunger and fear. As the sun sets, the students regroup, deflated, but determined to see their efforts as a noble failure. Confucius, ever the master of composure, praises them for their dedication. To sow seeds of virtue is never wasted, he says. You write it down, although you wonder how many of those seeds will ever sprout. Back at the compound, you reflect on the day's events. You realize that there is a kind of cruelty in the expectation that suffering people should also be wise, that virtue should grow in soil watered only by hardship. You wonder if your task to preserve the teachings of the Master is not just as a record of wisdom, but also a chronicle of its irrelevance. You begin to see your work in a new light. Perhaps you think the real lesson is not in the content of the advice, but in the fact that it so often goes unheard. The world, it seems, has its own priorities, and wisdom, for all its beauty, rarely makes the list. You wonder if this is what it means to be truly wise, not to be listened to, but to keep speaking anyway, out of habit or hope or simple defiance. That night, you carefully record your observation for future generations. The only thing more tiring than giving advice is listening to it. You do not know if anyone will ever read it, but the act of writing it brings a small measure of relief. As you extinguish your lamp and lie down to rest, you are haunted by the faces of the villagers, not angry, not dismissive, just tired. You feel a kinship with them that no philosophy can erase. In the end, you are all bound by the same unspoken truth. Wisdom is a luxury, and most people cannot afford it. You discover a new rhythm to your days, one that is defined less by the passage of time and more by the endlessly repeating tasks you perform for your chronicle. Each morning, after enduring whatever lesson the Master has chosen to deliver, you return to your cramped quarters and begin the ritual of rewriting. It is not enough, apparently, to have written the words once. The teachings must be transcribed again and again, checked and recopied until they reach a state of perfect, monotonous clarity. At first, you obey with the diligence of someone who still believes in the virtue of obedience. You copy every line, every phrase, every infuriatingly familiar maxim. To study without reflection is a waste. To reflect without study is perilous. You write, erase, and write again. The ink stains your fingers, then your sleeves, then the table itself. The slow, repetitive movement of your brush becomes a kind of music, a dull, relentless lullaby that soothes you even as it numbs your mind. But as the days blur together, you begin to sense a subtle shift. Each repetition seems to sap the life from the words. Where once you heard echoes of insight, now there is only static. You find yourself resenting the process. You wonder if wisdom, like bread, grows stale when handled too often. You start to question the point of this ceaseless copying. Are you preserving the Master's teachings for the ages? Or are you simply grinding them down, polishing them until nothing remains but a faint and flavorless residue? You think of the villagers who turned away from advice and the students who argued themselves into exhaustion. You think, too, of the silence that falls after each debate, not the peaceful hush of understanding, but the heavy, resigned quiet of people who have already moved on. It occurs to you, one sleepless night, that repetition is not only the mother of learning, but also the midwife of forgetting. The more you rewrite, the less you remember what you meant to preserve in the first place. Each new slip feels less essential than the last. The words blur into one another, shedding their edges, dissolving into a gray, formless mass. You wonder if this is how all wisdom ends, not in fire or revolution, but in a slow and thorough erasure. Despite your doubts, you continue. There is always another slip to be recopied, another teaching to be clarified. You invent small diversions to stave off boredom. You experiment with calligraphic flourishes, shading certain characters, shrinking others to the point of invisibility. You hide tiny, ironic messages in the margins. Here lies another piece of advice, suffocated by good intentions. Let the reader beware, wisdom may become hazardous if overexposed. These secret amusements are your only rebellion. Some days, the monotony threatens to overwhelm you. You lose track of time. The line between memory and invention begins to blur. You realize, with a chill, that you could change the order of the teachings, or even insert a saying of your own, and no one would be the wiser. The thought tempts you, but you lack the energy for mischief. Instead, you press on, content to be the loyal servant of other people's forgetfulness. You start to notice changes in yourself. You become forgetful, distracted, oddly serene. You stop caring about the details. You lose interest in the debates that once irritated you. Even the master's presence, his voice, his mannerisms, his steady gaze, fades into the general background noise of your life. Sometimes you wonder if you are becoming invisible, if the act of recording history has erased your own. It is during one of these long, gray afternoons, hunched over your writing desk, that you are struck by a terrible suspicion. Perhaps this is the true fate of all wisdom, not to enlighten, not to change the world, but to be endlessly repeated until it disappears. Perhaps this is why the ancients wrote in stone, not because their words were precious, but because they knew how quickly they would be worn away by the hands of the faithful. And yet, you keep writing. What else can you do? You are the guardian of a wisdom that is slipping from your grasp even as you try to preserve it. You are the servant of a ritual that no longer remembers its own purpose. You find comfort in the routine, even as you resent it. You tell yourself that at the very least, you are giving future generations the gift of boredom, a priceless inheritance in a world that is never short on suffering. In a final, private act of rebellion, you write a new maxim and slip it into the stack. The more often a truth is spoken, the less likely it is to be heard. You do not know if anyone will ever read it, but the thought gives you a moment's peace. As night falls and the lamp burns low, you gaze at your neat, endless rows of characters. You wonder what it would be like to let them all disappear, to erase every word and leave only silence behind. But for now, you keep writing, because that is what chroniclers do. You write, you repeat, and you hope, against all evidence, that something will remain. You have always known, in the abstract, that ideas can be dangerous, but it is not until the authorities take notice that you begin to understand just how precarious your task truly is. For months, your scribbling had gone unremarked, a quiet exercise in futility that threatened no one but your own wrists. Then one morning, the whispers reach your ears. Certain officials are disturbed by the proliferation of talk about virtue, order, and the duties of rulers. Some say there are too many questions, others that there are not enough answers. The result, as always, is the same: suspicion, followed by a crackdown. The warning comes from a fellow chronicler, a man whose caution has kept him alive through three successive regimes. Be careful, he mutters, glancing over his shoulder. The local magistrate has ordered an accounting of all books and writings. Anyone caught spreading seditious ideas will answer for it. You do not consider yourself a revolutionary. Your life has been one of compliance and compromise. Yet the realization that your innocence slips, your endless repetition of the master's sayings, could now be considered a threat. This fills you with a strange mixture of dread and pride. At last, you think, something you have written might actually matter. But pride is a luxury for safer times. For now, you must act. You gather your scrolls and slips, sorting them by risk. The harmless aphorisms, those about filial piety, the weather, the virtues of thrift, you leave out for anyone to find. The more pointed critiques of authority, the veiled warnings against tyranny, you hide in the dullest, dustiest parts of your quarters. Even so, you sense that this is not enough. By night, you work in secret. You copy the most dangerous teachings onto small scraps of paper, folding them into tight squares. These you slip between pages of tax records and agricultural ledgers, confident that no official will ever willingly read such tedium. Sometimes you go further, writing in codes only you can decipher, a name changed here, a proverb twisted just enough to pass as an accounting error. Each act of concealment feels like a crime and a confession. You catch yourself listening for footsteps in the hall, flinching at every unexpected knock. Your brush trembles in your hand. You think of the countless generations who have hidden their thoughts from those who claim to know what is best for others, and you wonder if you will be remembered as a coward or a hero. The atmosphere in the compound changes. Students speak more quietly. Some disappear altogether, sent home for the good of their families. The master continues his teaching with outward calm, but even he is more careful now, speaking in riddles and parables that leave the authorities none the wiser. You notice that he, too, has begun to write less and burn more. You dream, often, of your slips being discovered. Sometimes the officials arrive with torches and axes, scattering your careful work to the winds. Sometimes they read your secret messages and nod in grim approval, as if your worst fears are both justified and irrelevant. You wake sweating, your heart pounding, unsure whether you are more afraid of being caught or being ignored. You begin to notice how many of the master's sayings can be interpreted in more than one way. The ruler who does not listen to his people shall one day find himself alone. Is this merely advice for good governance or a warning to tyrants everywhere? You are tempted to ask, but prudence keeps your questions silent. At the market, You hear that a neighboring village has had its library confiscated. The chronicler there was led away in silence, his fate unknown. Your resolve hardens, mingled with a cold, sharp fear. The work must go on, but it cannot go on openly. You become an expert in invisibility. Your daily routines become a camouflage. You copy text tables with the same care you once reserved for the master's greatest sayings. You volunteer to help with inventory and storage, hiding your scraps where only the truly desperate will look. You wonder if the future will appreciate the lengths you have gone to save these words, or if they will only curse you for making them so hard to find. Sometimes you wish you could lay everything bare, pour out the full truth for anyone to read. But you know that history is a game of patience and cunning, not of bravery. Perhaps you think, this is the real wisdom. Survival requires silence as often as it demands speech. And so you persist. The pile of secret writings grows, each one a silent testament to the fragility of truth. You wonder what the master would say, if he would praise your caution or chide your cowardice. Maybe both. The chronicler's burden, you have learned, is not merely to record wisdom, but to keep it alive until it is safe to be wise again. At night, as the oil lamp burns low and shadows creep along the walls, you hide your last slip for the day inside a ledger of grain shipments. Let those who seek wisdom be patient, you write. The time for truth will return, even if none of us are here to see it. You close your eyes and hope for a moment that you will live long enough to read your own words again. With each passing season, you find yourself less certain about the very words you are sworn to preserve. There is, it seems, no end to the ways a phrase can be twisted, no final version of any teaching. Each day brings a new need for clarification, a new round of questions from students who demand to know not only what the master said, but exactly what he meant. It is as if clarity itself is the enemy, an ambiguity of virtue to be cherished above all. Your notes multiply. They swell into bundles, bound in twine and tucked under mats, hidden in baskets, stuffed between the ribs of the ancient shelves. You spend your evenings combing through previous copies, comparing lines, hunting for the precise turn of phrase that might settle an argument. Instead, you only find more arguments between different students, between different years, even between different versions of your own handwriting. The master, perhaps sensing your frustration, grows ever fonder of double meanings. He begins to speak in parables and riddles, each one less decipherable than the last. When the river is full, it seeks the sea. When the sea is full, it dreams of the river. The students nod wisely, then immediately begin to disagree about whether the river is meant to represent obedience, ambition, or the futility of life itself. You are left with the thankless task of committing these oracular sayings to paper. You try to capture every nuance, the subtle arch of the master's eyebrow, the pause before an especially cryptic line. But how does one record a hesitation? How do you preserve a silence so pregnant with meaning that the students will spend weeks arguing about what was not said. At first, you attempt to reconcile the contradictions. You write careful explanations in the margins, mapping out the possible interpretations of each teaching. Soon these notes overrun the original text, sprawling across the page in a web of uncertainty. It does not take long for you to realize that you are merely adding to the confusion. Each clarification spawns new doubts. Each answer breeds more questions. You try to console yourself with the thought that ambiguity is, perhaps, the only honest response to the complexity of the world. After all, are not the truest things always the hardest to say? Still, the work is exhausting. Your hand cramps, your eyes water. You grow more cautious with your brush, as if the act of writing might itself distort the meaning beyond repair. At night, you dream of conversations you never had, of sitting with the master as he explains, once and for all, what he meant by the sea, or the river, or the dream. In these dreams, his answers are always just out of reach, obscured by the sound of rain or the shifting of the wind. You wake to the knowledge that nothing will ever be settled, that the work of clarification will never end. Sometimes you resent the students most of all. Their questions, so earnest and unrelenting, seem to mock your efforts. You want to shout at them that there is no final version, no perfect formulation. That wisdom, if it exists, is not in the words themselves, but in the struggle to understand them. Instead, you respond with patient explanations, careful not to betray your own doubts. You notice that the more ambiguous the master's teachings become, the thicker your notes grow. What once fit on a single slip now sprawls over three or four, each annotated with references to previous debates, earlier attempts at resolution. The sheer mass of commentary threatens to swallow the original teachings whole. You begin to see your own role as part of the problem. By insisting on precision, by chasing after a meaning that refuses to hold still, you are helping to create a labyrinth that future chroniclers will find it impossible to escape. You imagine some poor soul 100 years from now, hunched over your notes, cursing your name as they try to disentangle your clarifications from the confusion you sought to dispel. Yet you cannot stop. Each day brings new questions, new uncertainties. You copy, you annotate, you rephrase, always hoping that the next version will be the one that endures. But the truth is, you no longer believe in the permanence of any answer. Everything you write feels provisional, subject to revision by the next anxious student who dares to ask, "But what did he really mean?" You find a dark comfort in this endless work. The ambiguity becomes a shield, protecting you from the expectation of certainty. If nothing is ever final, then nothing is ever truly lost. You are, in your own way, immortalizing the struggle for meaning rather than meaning itself. On nights when the doubt is strongest, you write your own riddle and hide it among the master's sayings. If clarity is a river, then wisdom is the mist that hovers above it. You wonder if anyone will notice, or if your words will be absorbed like all the others into the great swirling confusion of history. You close your eyes, knowing that tomorrow you will be asked once again to explain what cannot be explained. You will write, you will clarify, you will hesitate, and in the end, your caution will become its own kind of wisdom, dense, layered, and utterly impossible to unravel. You would think that after so much repetition, so much argument, so much agonizing over the slipperiness of meaning, you might eventually land on a saying that actually holds still, a maxim as solid as stone. But by now you have learned that every proverb is a shadow, and each shadow flickers according to the light of the person reading it. The Master offers yet another: do all things in moderation. Simple enough, you think, almost a relief after the riddle of the river and the sea. But as with all things in your world, simplicity is only an invitation to further confusion. You record the words, careful to shape each character with painstaking precision, as if clarity in form might produce clarity in content. The students seize upon the phrase like hungry dogs. Immediately the debate erupts. What is moderation? Who decides the measure? One student, earnest and thin, insists that moderation means eating only until you are no longer hungry. Another, more robust and clearly better fed, argues that moderation must be different for a laborer than for a scholar. A third, the most ambitious of the group, proclaims that moderation is a moving target, shaped by one's destiny. You watch as the conversation, predictably, devolves into personal attack and self justification. The would be ascetic accuses his rival of greed. The robust student returns the insult, hinting at laziness. The ambitious one, seeing no advantage in their bickering, retreats behind a wall of philosophical abstraction. By the time Confucius is summoned to arbitrate, the room is thick with resentment and fatigue. The master, true to form, refuses to resolve anything. The proper measure is found within yourself, he intones, and changes as the seasons do. The students nod as if enlightened, then immediately resume their disagreement, each now certain that his own inner sense of measure is the most correct. You dutifully record every word, every counter argument, every attempted definition of moderation. By the end of the day, you have filled 3 fresh slips with little more than synonyms and subtle insults. You realize, with a sense of dark amusement, that you have documented not a path to wisdom, but a catalog of human stubbornness. Moderation, you write in a private margin, is the art of calling your own habits virtuous and everyone else's excessive. At times, you wonder if the master is merely entertaining himself, that he crafts each new saying with just enough ambiguity to ensure endless debate, and then sits back to watch his students entangle themselves. Perhaps he knows that the measure of all things is so relative as to be useless, and perhaps, in his quiet moments, he finds this as funny as you do. The problem, of course, is that moderation is a moving target, not just between people, but within a single life. What seemed like moderation in your youth now looks like excess. What you once called restraint now feels like starvation. Even your own work falls prey to this. One day you believe that your efforts are essential, that you are the guardian of wisdom for all posterity. The next, you suspect you are merely indulging a pointless obsession, recording echoes for an audience that does not exist. You begin to notice that every saying of the Master, no matter how apparently universal, can be turned upon itself. Speak when you have something worth saying, but who decides what is worth saying? Be honest, even when it does not benefit you, but who decides when honesty is too costly? Moderation in all things, but who draws the line? In the evenings, you reread your slips and see only mirrors reflecting mirrors. Each new attempt at wisdom is simply a new way of saying that there are no fixed answers, only shifting contexts. You become fascinated with the paradoxes you are recording, to the point where you begin collecting them in a separate bundle. The only thing that should not be done in moderation, you write, is doubting moderation itself. The other students start to notice your lack of enthusiasm for their arguments. Some accuse you of cynicism, others of laziness. You smile, too tired to explain that you are simply further along the same road. It is not that you have lost faith in the teachings, only that you have seen enough to know that every rule is provisional, every maxim subject to revision. The master, you suspect, would approve. Late at night, you allow yourself a final heresy. What if all this talk of moderation is not a path to happiness, but simply a way to justify indecision? What if the point is not to live wisely, but to delay the moment of action for as long as possible? You record the thought in your private notes, half hoping someone will discover it centuries from now and laugh. As the lamps burn low and the night draws in, you set aside your brush, fingers stiff from overwork. The day's wisdom, moderation in all things, sits uneasily in your mind, neither comforting nor instructive. You are left with the sense that once again, the only certainty is uncertainty. Still, you write. Still, you record. For now, that is measure enough. You begin to feel the weight of repetition, not just in your hand, but deep in your bones. The cycle is unbroken. Dawn, teaching, argument, transcription, doubt, exhaustion, and finally, another restless night. There is a kind of symmetry to your days, but it brings no comfort, only a sense of being trapped in the slow, grinding gears of time. You wonder if you will ever escape this routine, if there is, beyond the horizon of your endless notes, a world where advice is neither needed nor heeded. Some mornings, before the rest of the compound stirs, you allow yourself a brief fantasy. What if, just once, the master advised everyone to sleep in? What if his wisdom included the virtues of idleness, the necessity of rest, the sanity to be found in a full and dreamless night? You imagine your fellow students' horror, the officials' scandalized expressions. You picture a world where wisdom is not a whip, but a balm, and where no one is praised for suffering more than absolutely necessary. But these thoughts are fleeting. When you open your eyes, the world remains stubbornly unchanged. Confucius, for all his supposed insight, never utters a single word about the joys of sleep or the beauty of laziness. His advice is always the same: endure, persist, labor, strive. You suspect that even his rare moments of humor are meant to sharpen the appetite for struggle, not to relieve it. You find yourself recording the same lesson on patience for the third time this week. Wait, and the way will reveal itself. All things in life come to those who endure. To grow angry at the slowness of change is to misunderstand the nature of change itself. You write, you recopy, you edit. Each new version is a little more tired, a little less inspired. Your own patience is wearing thin. You begin to resent not only the teachings, but the expectation that you will find meaning in them. You catch yourself daydreaming as you write, your mind wandering to places you have never seen and people you will never meet. Sometimes you pause, brush poised above the bamboo, and wish desperately that you could write something honest, something that would speak to your own exhaustion, your own longing for rest. But you do not. Instead, you force your hand to continue. You tell yourself that your suffering is proof of your devotion, that the pain in your wrist and the ache in your back are signs of some higher purpose. Yet each day the comfort these justifications bring grows thinner, more transparent. You begin to suspect that suffering, like wisdom, can be overvalued. In the evening, you listen as the students debate the merits of patience versus action. Their arguments are as predictable as the sunrise. Some insist that all problems resolve themselves in time, that to act too soon is to court disaster. Others argue that patience is a mask for cowardice, a way to avoid responsibility. You record their words, but your heart is not in it. You know, better than any of them, that the line between wisdom and weariness is as thin as the slip of bamboo under your hand. One night alone, as you struggle to keep your eyes open over yet another rewriting of the virtue of endurance, you imagine the master stepping quietly into your room. He finds you slumped over your desk, half asleep, and for once he offers not a rebuke, but a smile. "Sleep, chronicler," he says. "All the wisdom in the world is useless if you do not wake to remember it." The image is so vivid, so comforting, that for a moment you believe it is real. Then the oil lamp gutters, the illusion fades, and you are left alone with the silent mockery of your imagination. Your resentment becomes a private ritual. In the margins of your notes, you begin to write little heresies. Let those who preach patience try living through a single day in these rooms. Sometimes, the greatest wisdom is admitting that you are tired. If there is a virtue in suffering, I have earned sainthood. These secret lines become your own small rebellion, a record of your struggle against the endless tyranny of endurance. You wonder sometimes if any of this will matter, if anyone will ever read your chronicles and see not only the grand pronouncements and noble advice, but also the silent weariness that threads through every line. You hope, in a small and selfish way, that they will. Still, you write. Still, you endure. The cycle continues, and you are its captive. Perhaps this too is a kind of wisdom, not the wisdom of knowing, but the wisdom of surviving. Not the wisdom of the master, but the wisdom of those who record his words year after year as the seasons turn and the world remains unmoved. And in the last moments before sleep overtakes you, you whisper a prayer to no one in particular. Let there be a day, someday, when the greatest lesson is how to rest. As the months slip by in your shadowed corner, you begin to notice something peculiar. The so called wisdom of Confucius, which you have copied, annotated, debated, and half memorized, has an uncanny resemblance to the proverbs your grandmother used to mutter over her soup. In fact, with every passing week, it grows harder to distinguish the lofty teachings of the master from the ordinary sayings of the marketplace, the kitchen, or the rice field. One city, a young student proudly recites, "He who digs a well must first find water." You remember hearing this from an old farmer in your childhood, delivered with a wink and a pat on the head. Another student, eager to impress, solemnly intones, "A crooked tree casts a crooked shadow." Your mind drifts back to your mother, scolding your older brother for skipping chores with almost those exact words. You wonder if, in some alternate universe, your entire family might have qualified as philosophers, if only they had learned to deliver their scoldings in a slightly more ponderous tone. It is not that you begrudge the master his sources. After all, you have watched him listen to the people as much as he teaches them. You suspect, with growing amusement, that much of what passes for great wisdom is simply a well timed echo of what people already know. You imagine future generations gathering in hushed circles to dissect the meaning of "do not chase two rabbits at once," never suspecting it originated with a weary housewife and not with a sage beneath the stars. Your role as chronicler becomes increasingly surreal. You are tasked not only with recording the master's words, but also with sorting out which bits are truly his and which are merely borrowed from the common stockpile of human complaints. You invent a system of sarcastic footnotes, scribbled in the margins and hidden among the official calligraphy. Attribution dubious. Grandmother's kitchen, year of the late frost. Widely known among the fishermen, though phrased here with unusual gravity. Meaningless but comforting, best recited when nothing else will do. These private annotations become your secret delight. You take a kind of perverse pride in cataloging the humble origins of the master's most celebrated wisdom. Occasionally, you imagine your footnotes surviving into the future, discovered by some overeager scholar who will take them as evidence of your own deep insight, or more likely, your deep resentment. Of course, you dare not show these notes to anyone. The students are fiercely protective of the master's originality. They argue, sometimes for hours, about the authenticity of a particular phrase as if proving that Confucius invented the proverb would somehow make it more useful, more true, more likely to be followed. You sit through these arguments with the patience of a stone, knowing in your heart that truth is rarely improved by a pedigree. It becomes a game. How much of the master's reputation is built on the willingness of others to forget where they first heard a saying? You begin to see philosophy not as the discovery of new truths, but as the careful rebranding of old ones. Sometimes you wonder if the world would be better off if everyone simply admitted that wisdom is mostly repetition, recycled and reworded for each new audience. In your darker moments, you are tempted to invent a proverb yourself, something pleasingly vague and endlessly adaptable. The moon's reflection is clearest in troubled water. You picture students nodding solemnly, debates breaking out, footnotes multiplying. You never write it down, of course, but the thought brings a brief, mischievous smile. Still, the work continues. The master, for his part, is untroubled by questions of originality. He encourages his students to learn from anyone and anything. The wise man, he says, seeks knowledge even in the cry of a child or the silence of a stone. You dutifully record this, noting in the margin, heard from the potter's wife, market day, last autumn. Over time, you grow less interested in the pursuit of truth and more in the strange comfort that comes from hearing the same lessons in 100 different forms. You realize that, for all its pretensions, wisdom is often little more than a blanket, patched and restitched by every generation to fend off the cold of uncertainty. On lonely evenings, you read through your sarcastic footnotes and feel a bittersweet kinship with all the nameless ancestors whose advice has been borrowed, mangled, and elevated to the status of eternal truth. You wonder if they would be pleased to know their words live on, or merely amused that anyone takes them so seriously. And so you keep writing. The line between philosopher and grandmother grows ever fainter. The work becomes less about preserving the master's unique voice and more about chronicling the endless, communal conversation of humankind. You find, to your own surprise, a grim sort of hope in this, the hope that wisdom, however second-hand, will always find someone who needs to hear it. You end the day's notes with one final annotation hidden between the lines. Everything new is old, everything old, new again. The wheel turns, the sayings remain, and somewhere a grandmother nods in approval. After months, perhaps years, you have lost count of compiling, copying, and annotating. You decide that enough is enough. You resolve to do what every chronicler, in the end, tries and fails to do: bring order to chaos. If you are to preserve the teachings of Confucius for future generations, you reason, you must gather them into a system. Wisdom, surely, should not be a jumble of contradictions and recycled proverbs. It should be a map, a method, a lantern to guide the lost. Your first attempts are optimistic, even grandiose. You spread out your slips in neat rows on the floor, sorting them into categories: virtue, patience, honesty, moderation, authority, humility, self knowledge. The task is harder than it sounds. Every proverb, it turns out, wriggles free of its label. A saying about patience doubles as advice on humility. A comment about authority slides, slipperier than an eel, into the basket marked self doubt. The categories blur and collapse. You stare at your work, which now looks less like a system and more like the aftermath of a particularly energetic windstorm. You are undeterred. You try again, grouping the teachings by the people they seem to address. There are proverbs for rulers, for scholars, for laborers, for children, but who, in the end, is not sometimes a ruler and sometimes a child? Who can claim the advice about discipline does not also apply to kindness? The boundaries dissolve again, your grand design reduced to a mess of tangled string and splinters of bamboo. It is during this work that you experience what can only be called a revelation, not the illuminating kind, but the grim variety that comes in the middle of the night when your hands ache and your lamp is guttering. The pursuit of order, you realize, is an act of wishful thinking. The teachings were never meant to be a system. They are fragments, thrown out into the world like seeds, each landing where it may, each growing or withering according to luck, context, and weather. The irony is so sharp that you almost laugh aloud. Here you are, drowning in a sea of maxims, trying to build a boat from driftwood. You remember the master himself, always ready with a new parable or an old warning against the search for certainty. To force order upon the world is to invite disappointment, he once said. You wrote it down at the time, thinking it a little too pessimistic. Now you suspect it is the truest thing you have ever recorded, and yet the compulsion to categorize is hard to shake. You find yourself rearranging the slips night after night, convinced that just one more pass will reveal the hidden architecture of wisdom. Instead, each attempt yields a new version of the same paradoxes. Patience is a virtue, but not when it becomes cowardice. Humility is noble unless it invites contempt. To question is wise unless it undermines action. You write these in a separate bundle, labeling them not with categories, but with question marks. Other students, noticing your growing obsession, begin to avoid you. They sense, perhaps, that you are flirting with heresy, not the heresy of doubt, but the more dangerous heresy of seeing through the whole endeavor. You, the chronicler, are supposed to be the last believer, the guardian of the system. Instead, you have become its most skeptical observer. On particularly dark evenings, you find yourself writing confessions among your notes. There is no system, you scribble, only the illusion of pattern. What passes for order is merely our wish that the world makes sense. You imagine future generations stumbling upon your words and either nodding in agreement or recoiling in horror. Perhaps you think that is all philosophy really is, the attempt to draw a straight line through a maze. One night, as a storm rattles the walls of your chamber and wind howls through the cracks, you accept what you have known all along. Wisdom is not a system, but a chain of paradoxes, each link forged from uncertainty and contradiction. There is no final arrangement, no secret code. There is only the endless effort to make meaning where none will stick. You reflect on the fate of your own work. Will your tangled bundles of proverbs and private doubts be preserved? Or will some future chronicler attempt, as you did, to impose order only to end up right where you are now, surrounded by fragments and shadows, the illusion of pattern always just out of reach? There is a strange comfort in this thought. You realize that the effort itself, the doomed, noble effort, is a kind of wisdom. To keep searching for order even while knowing it does not exist is to admit, at last, that you are fully human. You end the day's work with a final note, written in a hand so tired it barely resembles your own. Irony is the only system that never collapses. Where there is wisdom, there is paradox. Where there is order, there is only the hope that chaos can be tamed, if only for a moment. And so you put out your lamp, surrounded by your unsorted slips, and surrender for one more night to the beautiful, tragic disorder of it all. It is the arrival of an old friend that disrupts your grim routine and reminds you, almost against your will, that wisdom is not always the quiet despair of sorting slips or the gray comfort of repetition. He appears at the compound gate one morning, mud on his boots and a lopsided smile on his face, looking less like the answer to a chronicler's prayer and more like someone who has learned to laugh at prayers altogether. You have not seen him in years. In the past, you shared long afternoons avoiding chores and mocking the pretensions of grown men. Now, as adults, you sense that little has changed beneath the surface. He greets you with a conspiratorial wink and, after a quick glance at your mountain of bamboo slips, bursts out laughing. You look as if you have been condemned to rewrite the world's most tedious book, he says. You grin despite yourself, feeling the years peel away for a fleeting moment. Over rice and weak wine, your friend listens to your tales of chronicling the master's wisdom. He tries to stifle his amusement, but every description, the endless repetition, the debates that solve nothing, the ever-growing cloud of interpretations, draws out another snort of laughter. You are keeping alive the world's oldest riddle, he says. Why do people keep pretending they want advice? For the first time in many months, you allow yourself to complain without restraint. You describe the cycles of doubt, the tedium of rewriting, the futility of organizing wisdom into neat little bundles. You tell him about the students who chase definitions until they vanish, about the villagers who greet advice with polite indifference, about the officials who want nothing but reassurance. Your friend listens carefully, but with a smile that never quite leaves his lips. When you have finished, he leans back and says, "Perhaps the greatest wisdom is not to take wisdom so seriously." You laugh, but his words linger. You find yourself wishing the master would say something so honest, so freeing, instead of another riddle about patience or humility. As the day fades, you and your friend sit under the drooping boughs of the courtyard tree, Watching students argue over the meaning of a proverb neither of you can quite remember. It is a kind of madness, your friend muses, to think that answers can save us. Most days, I am just grateful to know which problems are worth ignoring. The two of you talk late into the night, trading stories of foolish officials, stubborn parents, and the small indignities that come from being, as your friend puts it, too clever to be happy and not clever enough to be wise. There is a comfort in the shared cynicism, a release in the mutual recognition of the absurdity at the heart of all this recorded advice. Somewhere near midnight, the conversation takes a gentler turn. Your friend confesses that wisdom, for him, has become less about knowing what to do and more about learning to forgive himself for never living up to his own standards. The world, he says, is a place for mistakes. Maybe that is the only truth that matters. You are struck by the simplicity of it, the relief it offers from your chronicler's burden. You realize, with a start, that you have not laughed like this in a very long time. The sound is strange in your own ears, like the echo of someone you used to know. The heaviness that has settled in your bones from months of isolation and doubt lifts just for a moment. Before he leaves, your friend makes you promise to add a new proverb to your collection. Write this down, he insists, so that some future scholar will know that not that all wisdom is grim. He dictates, if you must choose between being right and being kind, be the one who can laugh at both. You agree, though you know it will be hidden between the lines, a secret for the rare reader who finds it. When the compound returns to its routines, you notice your perspective has shifted. The arguments still swirl, the ambiguities still multiply, but you are less invested in their outcome. You watch the other students with new eyes, recognizing in their fervor the same desperation you once carried. You understand now that wisdom is not a cure for the absurdity of life, but a way to find some dignity in living with it. You start to record not just the teachings, but also the laughter, the private jokes, the small moments of self mockery. In the margins, you begin to note every time a student tries too hard to be wise and ends up looking foolish. You find, to your surprise, that these notes give you more pleasure than any carefully preserved maxim. Sometimes, when no one is looking, you whisper your friend's advice to yourself. Be the one who can laugh at both. It becomes a kind of charm, a shield against the solemnity that once threatened to drown you. You realize, at last, that the work of the chronicler is not to rescue the world with answers, but to remind it, gently and with a touch of irony, that even the wisest advice is useless without the ability to laugh at yourself. That, perhaps, is the secret you have been searching for all along. And so, with a lighter heart, you return to your slips and your endless task, knowing that even if the world does not change, you have. Disaster, when it comes, is as mundane as spilled ink. There is no fire, no raid, no official pronouncement. It happens during a heavy rain, when the thatched roof above your quarters finally yields to the patient assault of water and gravity. You awake in the pre dawn gloom to find your carefully stacked bundles of slips soaked through, the black characters running in long, weeping lines. Some are already pulp, others clumped together in unreadable knots. You kneel in disbelief, cold water soaking your knees as you realize that months, perhaps years, of meticulous recording are dissolving before your eyes. You rush to save what you can. The most precious slips, those hidden in ledgers and beneath loose floorboards, survive, at least in part. But half, perhaps more, are ruined. You spread the survivors across the floor, desperately blotting them with scraps of cloth, holding them up to the weak light, willing the words to stay. Your hands tremble, not just from the chill, but from the shock of loss. For days, you are inconsolable. The students tiptoe around you, sensing your misery. Even Confucius himself pauses to offer quiet sympathy. All things return to earth, he says, even words. You try to find comfort in this, but the pain is too fresh. The advice you have preserved, the lessons, the debates, the private rebellions tucked into margins, has vanished as if it never was. The record of your suffering, your effort, your small victories and secret jokes is gone. You grieve not only for the lost words, but for the self that wrote them. The chronicler who believed, who doubted, who fought to preserve a wisdom he did not fully trust, that person seems to have vanished with the ink, leaving behind only exhaustion. For the first time, you consider giving up entirely. What is the point, you ask yourself, if everything is so easily erased? If a single storm can undo years of struggle, what hope is there for any memory to survive the future's weather? Yet life in the compound, indifferent as always, goes on. Lessons resume, new arguments arise. Someone misquotes the master, and the old debates begin anew. It strikes you with cruel clarity that most of what was lost has already been forgotten by everyone else. The other students cannot recall your careful clarifications, your catalogs of disputes, your marginalia. They do not miss what they never noticed. It dawns on you, slowly, that the advice of Confucius never truly belonged to the slips of bamboo. It lives, for better or worse, in the habits and phrases of those around you, in the way students quote him to each other, in the routine of morning lessons, in the weary laughter of your friend. The words you wrote were always only a shadow of the thing itself, and shadows are always at the mercy of light. You try to start again. It is harder than before, the effort tinged with bitterness and resignation. You write more slowly, less carefully. Sometimes, when you come to a maxim you once recorded in 10 different versions, you jot down only the one you can remember best, or the one that feels truest to the moment. The perfectionism that once drove you now feels like a kind of vanity. You begin to notice that some students, especially the youngest, those who missed the endless debates, have their own versions of the master's sayings. Some are wildly inaccurate, others ring with accidental wisdom. You find you no longer care which are authentic. Perhaps the point was never fidelity, but transmission, the willingness to pass on something, anything, even if it is only an echo. Late one evening, as you sift through a pile of half salvaged slips, you come across a fragment of your own handwriting, nearly illegible. Wisdom is not what survives, but what returns. You have no memory of writing it. For a moment, you are comforted. If your own words can surprise you, perhaps nothing is ever truly lost. You realize, at last, that you are not just chronicling the wisdom of Confucius, you are chronicling the futility and the persistence of trying to remember. The true lesson is not in the words themselves, but in the act of saving them again and again, knowing full well that loss is inevitable. The world will forget, the slips will rot, the names will fade. But still, someone will try to remember, and that, you decide, is a kind of victory. As you lay out a new slip and begin to write, you do so without hope or despair. You are no longer the naive scribe or the bitter archivist. You are simply a witness, a quiet participant in the ancient, stubborn ritual of memory. You write, knowing that what you record today may be gone tomorrow, but also knowing that someone someday will write again. And in this small, persistent act, you find a grim but genuine peace. There comes a day, you do not remember when, only that it is neither colder nor brighter than any other, when you find yourself at the end. The stack of slips is thinner now, the ink a little more faded, your own handwriting drifting toward illegibility. You realize, with something like disbelief, that you are preparing your chronicle not for reading, not even for preservation, but for disappearance. It must travel, as you have always known, into the future's oblivion. The compound is quieter these days. The master is older, his words less frequent. The students, those few who remain, walk the halls in pairs, discussing the future with the anxious hopefulness of people about to inherit a debt. You observe their rituals with a kind of detached affection, remembering a time when you too thought there would be an answer at the end of all this labor. You take stock of your record, such as it is. What you once imagined as a monumental achievement now seems, at best, a collection of footnotes to someone else's life. The slips are full of repetition, contradiction, jokes that only you would understand, complaints you never dared to voice aloud, and questions that seem less urgent than they did when you started. You wonder if any of it will mean anything to the next chronicler, if there will even be a next chronicler. You prepare the manuscript for its uncertain journey. You wrap the surviving slips in cloth and tie them tight with twine. You resist the urge to annotate, to explain, to justify your omissions and failures. There is a kind of mercy in restraint, you decide. The future will invent its own meanings, as you did, and as those before you surely did as well. You are struck by how much of what you have recorded would be lost on anyone not already immersed in the strange and endless world of Confucian advice. Your sardonic margins, your secret notes of doubt, your careful catalog of student arguments, all of these, you suspect, will be skipped or misunderstood by anyone with enough optimism to search for wisdom in old words. And yet this prospect no longer stings. There is a dignity, you realize, in knowing that your labor is just another layer in the compost heap of history. You catch yourself laughing quietly as you tie the final knot. After all, your caution, your fear of censors, your tireless preservation of every ambiguous phrase, it is entirely possible that your manuscript will be lost in a flood, eaten by rats, or used to kindle a kitchen fire. It might survive only as a rumor, a joke, a misquotation on the lips of someone who never knew your name. The thought is strangely freeing. Before sealing the bundle, you add one last note, written not as a maxim, but as a confession. Let the reader know, if any should be so unlucky as to read this, that most wisdom is misunderstood, and much of it is best forgotten. If there is any value in these pages, it is only that someone cared enough to write them. With the package finished, you are left with nothing but the quiet. The master, when he learns of your plan to send the slips away, simply nods. A chronicler's labor is never his own, he remarks, but the world turns on such labors nonetheless. You wonder if he is comforting you or himself as you wait for the courier who will carry your bundle to a safer place, though nowhere is ever truly safe. You find your thoughts turning not to the advice you have saved, but to the voices and faces that surround it. You remember the student who argued himself hoarse over the meaning of patience, the friend who taught you to laugh at the whole sorry business, the villager who shrugged at virtue and went back to mending his fence. Their stories, too, are preserved, not in slips of bamboo, but in the strange amalgam of memory, regret, and affection that fills the hours before a parting. You realize in this moment that your true legacy is not wisdom, but irony. The next generation may find your work tedious or even amusing, but you hope, with a grim sort of pride, that they will at least see the joke. You imagine them rolling their eyes at your warnings, your endless lists, your neurotic footnotes, and then, just maybe, smiling in recognition. As the night settles in and you send your manuscript into the dark, you finally allow yourself to rest. Your hands are empty, your doubts quieter, your sense of purpose both diminished and strangely complete. You have done what was required and more than was necessary. You have left behind a record, not of wisdom, but of a long, uncertain search for it. And if that is not enough for the future, so be it. After all, the future never asked for your help. Sleep, when it finally comes, is thin and restless. You wake as often as you dream, tangled in the blankets of memory, haunted by all you have written and all you have failed to say. In the pale light before dawn, you stare at the empty space where your bundles once sat, a hollow on the desk that feels like both a loss and a liberation. For the first time in years, your hands are idle. The room is too quiet, the silence so absolute it rings in your ears. The compound, too, is quieter. Confucius rises later now, walking more slowly in the morning chill. You watch him from a distance, noticing the stoop in his shoulders, the care with which he chooses his words, as if wary of spending too much wisdom at once. The students are subdued, unsure what to do without the anchor of your endless copying and questions. You sense that something is ending, and that endings are rarely marked by ceremony, more often by a subtle vanishing of sound and habit. You are left with yourself. No brush, no bamboo, no grand task to distract you from the emptiness. For days you wander the compound in a fugue of uselessness, uncertain whether you are meant to begin again or simply wait for the next assignment from fate. You try to listen to the master's words with fresh ears to see if, stripped of your chronicler's burden, they might strike you as new. They do not. Instead, you hear only the soft fatigue behind them, the echo of a man who has grown used to being misunderstood. Late at night, you sit at your desk, staring at the blank surface, wishing for one last piece of advice, not from the master, but from yourself. What wisdom remains for those who have already recorded all the wisdom they could bear? What comfort is there for the chronicler now that his chronicle is done? You think of all the sleepless nights, the frustration and doubt, the private jokes and hidden rebellions. You remember the many times you almost gave up, almost rebelled, almost let the whole project dissolve into silence. And you realize, with a kind of grim satisfaction, that the greatest lesson is the one you never wrote down. Advice is always for someone else. The people who seek it are rarely those who need it. The people who preserve it are never the ones it saves. You cannot help but laugh, softly, at the bleakness of it all. You picture the future, some distant reader picking over your words, searching for comfort or instruction or meaning. You hope in your most generous moments that they will find something worth the effort. But in your more honest moods, you suspect they will simply read themselves to sleep, lulled by the repetition, soothed by the predictability of ancient sorrow. In the end, you take up your brush one final time, not to write a teaching or clarify a contradiction, but to record a last private thought. The words come slowly, as if you are carving them out of the air itself. Wisdom is boring, and that is why it survives. It is not meant to stir the soul, but to anchor it, to lull the restless heart through another night of doubt. You place the slip where only you will see it, a secret coda to your years of labor. Perhaps someday, when your own memory falters, you will read it again and feel, if not pride, then at least recognition. Perhaps that will be enough. As dawn breaks over the compound, you close your eyes at last and let the weight of it all drift away. The world outside is unchanged, indifferent to your efforts, unmoved by your loss, untouched by your small acts of preservation. The wisdom of Confucius endures not because it is profound, but because it is patient, persistent, content to wait in the shadows for someone else's sleepless night. You allow yourself to rest, knowing that for now, your part in this endless, ironic history is complete. You have done your duty, chronicled your doubts, and joined the long procession of forgetful, hopeful, quietly mocking scribes who came before you. And as sleep finally claims you, you smile at the simplest truth of all. Some wisdom saves lives, but most of it only helps you survive another night.